holidays as, hurrah for the fun is the pudding done, hurrah for the pumpkin, just hurrah, everything's just wonderful, hurrah, it's so great, we go to grandmother's house, and it's just lovely, and there we all are. And so I wanted to talk about gratitude and maybe opening our understanding of gratitude a bit. And it's indeed wonderful to be grateful for the pumpkin pie and the warmth and the happiness and loveliness of the holidays and all of the goodness in our lives. And the Buddha invites that kind of appreciation and gratitude and delight even. How good, how wonderful. We're invited at the beginning of our practice, at the beginning of our meditation practice each day, and maybe at the beginning of our day itself, to really contemplate gratitude. What are we grateful for? What are we happy about? What are we delighted in? To bring that kind of ease and spaciousness and just quality of wholesomeness into our hearts and minds. So it is good, and it's all part of our practice. How wonderful. Sometimes when we listen to Buddhist teachings or when people talk about Buddhist teaching, they can sort of imagine or suggest that gratitude, that really is, Buddhist teachings are about suffering and the end of suffering and just all this hard stuff. And it is true that there is that inquiry, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but it's not true that the absolute delight and wonder of our lives and our bodies and our relationships and our being isn't intended and open to that quality of deliciousness and delight. So as we move to the holidays, and we'll sit around, many of us will sit around our Thanksgiving table, and someone will say, what are you grateful for? What are you happy about? And our hearts will be touched as we offer our own and one another, and it's all good. And at the same time, around that same Thanksgiving table, when we come to our actual circumstances, we can say, well, I don't know that song meant this house, or, this meal, or this gathering. And to say, hurrah for this, can be a bit of a challenge. I have a friend who used to speak about, and thinking he was what he called a misplaced zygote. He said he really, even as a little child, thought that fertilized egg had somehow found its way into the wrong womb. And that can be true for some of us. We sort of imagine that somehow we found our way into just the wrong family, or the wrong circumstance, or the wrong country, or the wrong, whatever. And that we're somehow misplaced. And that we, the challenge somehow is to get placed properly, to get, to get into somehow the right circumstances, or better yet, to correct the circumstances that we're in, and fix them so that we can truly have gratitude, we can truly delight. But actually, the teachings tell us that there's no mistake. There's no mistake. And then our practice of gratitude includes everything. Everything. Being grateful to everything. This is from the Buddha. He says, for the learned one who has comprehended Dharma, meaning comprehended, the way things work, who clearly sees this world and the next, desirable things do not provoke the mind, meaning we don't grasp after them with greed. Towards the undesired, he has no aversion. So the issue is not whether things are desirable or undesirable or pleasant or unpleasant, but whether they are provoking the mind in some way or another. Whether they're pushing or pulling us in one practices as much, delighting in the pumpkin pie and the turkey and the cranberries, and really delighting in it, and just pausing, noticing when there's greed, to say, one piece of pumpkin pie is good, maybe two would be even better. We can sort of watch that kind of difficulty, actually, delighting in the delightful, because there's some suffering there, there's some kind of pushing for more. And perhaps even more prominent, we can notice when there's some sense that there's something going around in this gathering, that Uncle Otto or Aunt Mabel or, the brother-in-law who comes, he drinks too much, and, the football game that doesn't go the way we want, or the mashed potatoes that get burned, or whatever it is that's going on, or the difficulties out there in the world, that we can't be grateful for, because that's wrong, that's a problem. And the Buddha is teaching us that it's not those things that are the problem, but what happens in our mind about them. That suffering arises in the mind, and the challenge that the Buddha offers us is to cultivate the capacity to be with it all, and indeed to be grateful for it all. Grateful for it all. Wow. This is the Buddha again. He says there are two extremes which should not be practiced by anyone who has begun purification. The hunt for sensual pleasures, which is low, vulgar, the common way of ordinary worldlings, ignoble and disadvantageous. And any practice of self-torture, which is painful, ignoble, and also quite disadvantageous. He says, without veering towards either of these extremes, basically I won't read the whole paragraph, has awakened to this middle way, which leads to assured vision, to direct knowledge, which leads to ease, to peace, to certain knowledge, to enlightenment. And what is that middle way awakened to by the Buddha, which leads to assured vision, to direct knowledge, which leads to ease, to peace, to all certain knowledge, to enlightenment? It is this very noble eightfold way. So in all of the teachings, he's basically inviting us to learn how to be into the trees with gratitude and delight. Gratitude. In Tibetan teachings, they speak of relational difficulty as I love this, as a precious treasure, very difficult to find. So of difficulty is a precious treasure. Think about that when you're at your Thanksgiving dinner. Difficulty as a precious treasure. Over the river and into the trees. A precious treasure, very difficult to find. By the way, there's an article, those of you who know Tricycle, the magazine Tricycle, which is also available online. I found this quote. There's an article by our own UVA's own Jeffrey Hopkins on these teachings, so it's a nice elaboration of just exactly that quote. It's in the current Tricycle, and you can go online, and I believe you can access that article without being a subscriber. So it's Tricyy. And Nisargadatta says the problem is not desire. So the problem isn't, desiring and loving the delightful. The problem is that your desires are too small. You're not including everything in your desires. So the teaching is not at all that we should not delight in or be grateful for the goodness, the deliciousness of the meal or the gathering or the holidays or all the goodness in our lives, but that our gratitude is too small. Gratitude is too small. Can we also desire to be with the challenging key to this is in understanding how suffering arises and how it works. And we tend to think that it's sort of obvious. You know, suffering arises when Aunt Eleanor starts talking at the table, and she just won't stop. Okay? That it has to do with something somebody is doing out there. And the Buddha is inviting us to cultivate the capacity to learn, first of all, and then to reflect on, and then to practice the awareness, the deep knowing that suffering arises wholly in our own minds. And that the difficult that arises, those places where we get snagged, the reason that's a precious treasure is it's pointing right to the place where the mind is contracting around something, where the mind has an opinion that I could be happy if. And those places where we are, we find ourselves really kind of struggling. And we all have so many of them, don't we? Those are the places that have little signs on them that say, look here. The key to freedom of suffering is right here. Shinzen Yang used to say, somebody asked him one time, he said, can we be enlightened by just work? We talk so much about working with difficulty. And somebody asked him, can we be enlightened by working with just the pleasant? And he said, of course. It's just so much harder. Because with the pleasant, we tend to kind of sort of snuggle into it and forget to be awake. Whereas with the difficult, we the invitation there, and should, sort of the invitation, should you accept it, is to really look to see what's getting you caught here. So suffering arises in the mind. You've heard this quote from me and from others over, the Course of the Fall. Mind is the forerunner of all things. Mind is their master. They are all mind-made. Speak or act with an impure mind, meaning a mind that's clinging to something, that has an opinion about how something should be. And sorrow will follow you as surely as the wheel follows the ox that draws the cart. Mind is the forerunner of all things. Mind is their master. They are all mind-made. Speak or act with a pure mind, and happiness will follow you as your shadow, unshakable. I want to talk just a little bit about the Buddhist teaching on how that works. And as I was preparing the talk, I was realizing that I could easily kind of veer off into another whole talk, so I'll try to navigate this without going too far astray. But the Buddha is inviting us in his own contemplation. He actually saw how suffering arises. And so then he started teaching. He says, what happens is that one of our senses makes contact with something. The eye makes contact with something that's outside this organism. And as it makes contact with something, there's a feeling quality that's associated with it. It comes up at the same moment. It's pleasant or it's unpleasant or it's neutral. It just sort of is. It's not necessarily that first moment of contact. It's not necessarily a conditioned thing. It's just, it's like an amoeba. If you prick an amoeba, it has contact with the little skin, and it's unpleasant. It'll kind of pull back. So the whole first step is that those first three things, where there's an organ, an eye or an ear or a brain or a tongue, and there's contact, and something is either pleasant or unpleasant or neutral. And then the next step is that the mind, the conditioned mind, if you will, what we've learned over time, is we start to kind of get a sense of, it's this. perception, and very quickly there's a word that's associated with it. So we see this thing, and we can sort of notice that we actually don't see the shape. I mean, we don't need so much the shape or the, it's kind of cool, I can feel that. But that we say, oh, cool, it's a word, it's a, or a glass. It's this. Okay. So now we have contact with something. It's now a this and not a that. So, so anything that kind of has these similar characteristics becomes a this. We can begin to see, this is about 12 talks, including 5 minutes here. We can begin to see that the world starts to get narrow. That we have all this sensory input. And now we're saying it's of this and not of that. And I started to, I've been practicing with this, and as I was working with it, I began to see that our words, all of our words, are actually like little prisons. They're like little boxes, little metal boxes, where we take our experience and we put them into a word, and then we start living within the word. So, for example, I mentioned Uncle Otto, so that we don't approach Uncle Otto brand new. But we see this figure in the doorway, and now we know that, okay, that's who that is. And then the next step, which you will recognize, is not only is that Uncle Otto, or not only in this case is that a glass, but the next step is now we have a whole slew of narratives about how Uncle Otto used to be, how I am sure he is right now, and how he's going to be at the dinner table. And so now we have an even bigger prison that's elaborated by, all of this narrative. They're called sankharas, this kind of historical narrative, if you will. And I don't even have to know this person. There's a person who appears in the doorway, and and my mind goes, man. And even there, even before I even know this person, I have all this narrative, right, about what men are like. And so now I'm kind of imprisoning my experience in whole layers, layers of moving toward or away from something pleasant or unpleasant. A label that I apply because my conditioning as a human being is such that I've learned how to do that. And then a whole kind of stuff of narrative. And now I'm living within that whole system. So that whatever data arises, it's not fresh, it's not alive. It's actually has a lot more to do with what's going on in my own head than it has to do with what's going on up there. And indeed, then I start behaving in a certain way, and in a certain way, we all know how this works, in a certain way, we tend to call forth those very qualities from the people we interact with. So the Buddha is saying, this becomes then the prison of our suffering. Because we can't, when we're caught in this, we really can't see what's actually happening here. And indeed, what's called for. It doesn't mean that Uncle Otto, or this being in my life, is necessarily being incredibly wholesome or skillful. But it might mean that it would be wholesome if there were some kind of spaciousness around my response, such that I, wasn't engaged in some kind of automatic, reactive, blah, 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 we know how that goes. So these places where we start to suffer, the Buddha invites us to begin to practice and notice, are the places that ideally then, in our practice, point us back to this whole process internally, so that we can begin to kind of tease it apart. Not necessarily an easy process. Those of you who've heard me talk before have heard the story about an issue I had with my husband where this was happening, and I kept finding myself in prison, behaving in an unwholesome way and really struggling. And as I worked with it and worked with it and worked with it, you've heard me say it took me 10 years of working with it to really kind of find a place of real freedom and real spaciousness. And, I'm pretty diligent about this stuff, all things considered. So it's not necessarily easy, but by the same token, to keep falling into, that prison, that trap, isn't necessarily easy either. It's familiar, but not necessarily easy. So the Buddha invites us to remember that there is always a door out of danger. No matter what the suffering is, no matter what the challenge is, no matter what the difficulty is, that the difficulties are arising in our own minds. It doesn't mean that that person out there is being completely wholesome. It means my suffering around that is arising not out there, but in here. So given that the difficulties arising in my own mind, and that this is all conditioned, that there's a doorway to freedom. Freedom is possible. Wow, how cool is that? And indeed, the very first step, well, here, let me read you a quote. This is from Rilke in his Letters to a Young Poet. He says, "You are so young, so before all beginning, and I want to beg you, as much as I can, to be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart, and to try to love the questions themselves, like locked rooms, and like books that are written in a very foreign tongue. So to try to love those difficulties themselves. Do not now seek the answers which cannot be given to you, because you would not be able to live them. The point is to live everything. Live the questions now." I think he would say, live the suffering now, inquire into it. Perhaps you will then gradually, maybe in fewer than 10 years, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer. Take whatever comes with great trust. Hate nothing. So can we appreciate, can we have gratitude for these places of questions, these places of confusion? When we find ourselves over the river and into the trees, can we cultivate, can we open in gratitude? If we're really paying attention, the first blessing that arises in these moments is very often confusion. Rilke refers to loving the questions. We kind of sit there and we go, all right, if I don't go into that habitual pattern, I don't have a clue what to do. I don't know what to do about that. Forget about what to do out there. I don't know what to do with my own feelings, my own responses, my own thoughts. I don't know what to do. So, the invitation is to appreciate that confusion. Confusion can be an entry, a little sign. Here's the doorway. Here's a place where you're stepping out of some habitual response. And the first awareness is, well, if I don't have a habitual response, I don't know what to do next. I don't even know how to pay attention to my experience. So confusion isn't necessarily, let me say that more strongly, confusion isn't unwholesome. Can be an incredibly wholesome response. We start looking for the doorway, if you will, the gate to this prison that we find ourselves in. What's the way out of this? This is the Buddha. The Buddha himself, he almost didn't teach because he knew that we were so confused and that it would be hard to do this work. He says, the Dhamma that I have attained is deep, hard to see, hard to realize, peaceful, refined, beyond the scope of conjecture, beyond the scope of our kind of thinking about it, subtle, to be experienced by the wise. But this generation delights in attachment, is excited by attachment, enjoys kind of clinging to the familiar. For a generation delighting in attachment, excited by attachment, enjoying attachment, this, that, conditionality, and dependent co-arising, the way this whole process takes form, is hard to see. This state, too, is hard to see. The resolution of all fabrications, the resolving, kind of the letting go of all that mental stuff. The relinquishment of all acquisitions, the ending of craving, dispassion, cessation, unbinding. So he says, the whole thing is hard. I get it. And I think maybe I shouldn't even bother teaching because it's so hard that people might not understand, and it would just be too challenging. He says, he was actually besieged by one of the gods to teach. He said, okay, fine, I'll do that. One of the people in our modern life, I think, I don't know if you're familiar with Carolyn Hax, who has a column in the Washington Post. I think she might be a relative of the Buddha. Because I think she's incredibly wise. Sometimes I'll read a question that somebody has, and then she'll come back with this just awesome response that goes about 4 layers deeper than I was thinking. Just amazing, really beautiful. This is Carolyn Hax. So the Buddhist thing was a little hard. This is Carolyn Hax. She says, in response to somebody, she says, everything I advise is easier said than done. Figuring out how to handle people is hard. Figuring out how much honesty is appropriate is hard. Figuring out how much withheld information becomes dishonest is hard. Figuring out whom we can and can't trust is hard. Figuring out how to trust ourselves is hard. Figuring out how much help we need, have a right to ask for, and can advisably accept is hard. Finding ways to leave painful things behind us is hard. Finding words at a tense moment that make things better instead of worse is hard. Accepting what we'll never have, whom we'll never be, what will never be given, what we can't expect is hard. Admitting when we're at fault is hard. Accepting when we're not at fault, but we'll suffer anyway, is hard. It's not about being unruffled. It's about retraining ourselves to use approaches to people, approaches that are more productive than the broken, maddening, ineffective, self-destructive old ones. It's about figuring out what the limits are of what we'll take from people and enforcing them in ways that keep our self-respect and sense of goodwill. Keep our self-respect and sense of goodwill. Enforcing them in ways that keep our self-respect and sense of goodwill. And ideally, our relationships intact. It's stuff we can take decades to get right, if then, and bandy about in overlong discussions like this one, she says, and still not fully solve or fully agree on. Doesn't mean it's not worth trying. This is Sogyal Rinpoche in the Tibetan book of Living and Dying. He says, I cannot say it strongly enough. To integrate meditation in action is the whole ground and point and purpose of meditation. Then, after meditation, it's important not to give in to the tendency we have to solidify the way we perceive things. So what really matters is not just the practice of sitting, but far more the state of mind you find yourself in after meditation. All too often, people come to meditation in the hope of extraordinary results, like visions, lights, or some supernatural miracle. When no such thing occurs, they feel extremely disappointed. But the real miracle of meditation is more ordinary and much more useful. It is a subtle transformation, and this transformation happens not only in your mind and your emotions, but also actually in your body. It is very healing. Become as resourceful in inspiring yourself to enter your own peace as you are at being neurotic and competitive in the world. So gratitude. Are we willing to be with our own struggles? First of all, with the difficulties, but really, more deeply, with our own struggles with the difficulties. Are we willing to be with those and be grateful for them? As little signposts at the doorway that invite an inquiry into where is deeper freedom. Can we cultivate the capacity to see every moment of stress? Every moment of stress. Standing in line at bed and bath. Every moment of stress. The grocery store. The traffic. Are we willing to cultivate the capacity to see every moment of stress as a potential for opening? A potential for freedom? To release the habitual stories we tell ourselves, to show up now, in the present, in our own internal experience, to see how it is now for me. To ask the kind question of ourselves, how can I be with this? With just a tiny air of kindness, openness, spacious, just a little bit less suffering. Just this, how can I be with this? Here's a poem from Hafiz. He says, now is the time. Now is the time to know that all that you do is sacred. Now, why not consider a lasting truce with yourself and God? Now is the time to understand that all your ideas of right and wrong were just a child's training wheels to be laid aside when you finally live with veracity and love. Hafiz is a divine envoy whom the Beloved has written a holy message upon. My dear, please tell me, why do you still throw sticks at your heart and God? What is in that sweet voice inside that incites you to fear? Now is the time for the world to know that every thought and action is sacred. Now is the time for you to compute the impossibility that there is anything but grace. Now is the season to know that everything you do is sacred. Hafiz invites us, maybe especially during this season of challenges, everything we do, every moment, everything that arises is sacred. Hafiz is a divine envoy whom the Beloved has written a holy message upon. So are you. So is Uncle Adam. Now is the season to know that everything you do, everything that arises, is sacred. May we practice gratitude